Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
We wanted to talk this week about authority complexes. This is something that people bring into analysis all the time in little ways and big. Most of us have some difficulty with authority. Maybe this shows up in relationship to our partner, or perhaps our boss and our job, or how we get in our own way when we're trying to complete a project. So we're wondering, what about that? And it turns out that there are many ways that depth psychology can speak to this phenomenon.
Well, what I'm thinking about is how we all begin with an authority figure. It's called mom. And later on, not very much later on, it's called dad. That they tell us what to do and what we can't do, and they take care of us. We would be lost without an authority figure or figures who pick us up and change our diapers and make sure that we eat the right foods and all of that kind of thing. And so it gets hardwired into us from the very beginning.
Long before there's a verbal relationship to our parents, that their entire way of being envelops us both psychologically and physically.
Although I also do remember my mother saying, I'd say, well, why do I have to do it? And she'd say, because I said so. So there is that can be overtly stated, and I think every kid knows that part of the parent.
And Deb, I like that you lifted up both parts, that an authority figure tells you what to do and also takes care of you. Mm-hmm. And I think that often when we have a problematic authority complex that's getting us into trouble, we are very aware of the part where the authority is telling us what to do. What we're not so aware of is what's in shadow, maybe, is our desire to be cared for by that authority. That we haven't owned that piece yet.
And it's very comforting, legitimately comforting for a child to be able to relax in the care of, we're saying, an authority figure, but it's infused with love and empathy, looking out for our best interests, putting us first. There are all kinds of positive aspects to this kind of authority, of truly, deeply being cared for, and we wouldn't come into being unless we had that, not fully.
Well, there is all that positive dynamic, but also in the early object relations work, like Melanie Klein, the satiety of desire is the primary positive relationship to the parent, and there's an immediate ambivalence between when that satiety is denied and when it's granted. So even very early on, there's an ambivalent relationship, a kind of rage when the needs aren't met, and a love and a positive split when things are met. So really at the basis of the relationship, Klein would say there's a good breast and a bad breast right from the beginning, because parents are unable to constantly meet an infant's needs. So I think right from the beginning, there's this kind of tension. So back in that object relations lens, at least for a moment, our relationship to authority right from the beginning has to do with whether our needs are met by the authority or whether they're frustrated by the authority figure.
Well, and I like that you're pointing out that this is there right from the beginning, because there's a way that a central developmental task is to wrestle with authority, come to terms with that, and ultimately claim it for ourselves, which means we both claim the power and the autonomy that come along with authority, and the responsibility of taking care of ourselves, which is sort of the other half that, again, sometimes falls into shadow.
But from a psychoanalytic standpoint, Lisa, I am curious, do you think that we ever truly transcend the parental complex? Or isn't that engine constantly talking to us in the background, referencing the ego to some kind of an authority structure?
Well, I mean, authority is a fact of life, right? And in all kinds of ways, both just practically and psychologically, we need to have authorities that we cede our own personal authority to for one reason or another. I mean, for example, I am not going to spend all of my time trying to pick stocks for my retirement portfolio. So I hand that over to Vanguard and I let them worry about it. That there's just no possible way we can practically assume authority over every aspect of our life. But I do think there's something about the developmental task of creating an ego standpoint that can have a conscious relationship to different kinds of authority.
And I think that's the key word, is a conscious stance versus assumed or unconscious kind of ceding of personal power. That's the development, isn't it?
And I'm thinking about the feelings that go along with that kind of conscious decision of, I'm going to get a stockbroker or a financial advisor. So versus the feelings of resentment or anger or fear that if I don't do this, some drastic punishment is going to land on my head. The feeling state of toward authority, I think, is a huge clue as to what is going on in a person. And does that person feel coerced, or does that person feel, indulged or seduced in some way? Those are the feeling states that go along with an authority complex, or what we might call a complex.
I think that there's a secret underside to an authority complex that has to do with entitlement. That's what I see, Deb, picking up on the feeling state. When someone comes in with a sense of resentment, what I hear underneath that is a sense of entitlement, like you were going to do something for me. And I'm owed this. I'm owed something somehow. I'm owed something, rather than this real kind of bedrock sense of I'm responsible for my own life.
That the responsibility is kind of an antidote to bringing one's hunger and needs to an authority with the expectation to be met there.
So we might say if someone has an authority complex, that there is an over-orientation toward the other. That the other either is meeting my needs and I am therefore dependent for getting my needs met on this source or sources, or I resent it because they were supposed to, quote unquote, and they didn't. So it's a focus external rather than that great phrase of an internal locus of control, of I have energy and libido, and I have areas where I can be in charge of what I do, where I go, and kind of master of my own destiny, at least internally in terms of my own well-differentiated, self-supporting, well enough developed ego.
And that goes to whether or not something is being projected or internalized, which is at the core of our psychological system. The more unconscious someone is about these authority dynamics, the more that they're going to project it out into a family system, their spouses, the government, their job, their boss, and the more it's going to play out in this external field and feel more like fate. The more people understand that the outer experience is a reflection of an inner system, and that the secret of what's going on around me actually is in my own heart. That's the secret of changing the locus of control and power.
So I love that, Joseph, and I want to sort of slide into it a little bit more concretely, which is, can we give some examples? Do you think, just some hypothetical examples of maybe what this looks like in a person's life? And I'll throw one out there. Maybe someone hasn't settled into this conscious relationship with authority and feels this kind of secret entitlement / defiance. And so when she's in a job, she does things like just finds ways, shadowy ways, to trick the system a little bit, maybe falsifies her timesheets, that kind of thing. Because, she feels like they really should be paying her more. And when she's asked to do things by her boss, maybe she feels she gets her back up a little bit, and so doesn't complete the work on time, or does so, but there's something kind of tricky and backhanded about it, and loses job after job after job after job. I mean, I have worked with people like that.
So is that a kind of passive-aggressive dynamic that the person is really not aware of this kind of entitlement that says, I'm cutting corners, but I don't really take responsibility for it. And instead, other people come along and fire me.
I'm not going to bow to your authority. I'm not going to submit to this, right? It's like a way of trying to consolidate an ego standpoint, but it's a kind of ersatz sort of differentiation.
Yeah, I heard both trickster dynamics as well as passive-aggressive behavior. The idea of mucking around with the timesheet to sip off a little extra money. I think that when we are either in a truly oppressive authority system, or at least we believe we are, that it constellates the archetype of the trickster inside of us. And then we can have this, correct or incorrect, feeling that we have to steal in one way or another to be able to survive a system that we cannot escape. And of course, that's the first illusion that people are caught in. They're in a job they don't like, and somehow they feel like they can never escape it. And then they feel they have to become trickstery and thieving because they're trapped in the system. And so a lot of times in analysis, some of our work is, why do you think you can't get another job? Or why do you think you can't move yourself into a system that's more friendly to you, or at least you perceive as more friendly to you? And then secondarily, in this feeling of being trapped, then all of a sudden, this place that anger and rage goes to, that shows up as obstructive behavior through noncompliance.
Of helping a person find his or her power in the world, power to change a job, and to become more conscious of, this is how I work, this is what I've been doing. How else might I get what I want in the world in a more legitimate and more satisfying way? That really, I think, is the core. It's not about doing things right, quote unquote. It's about what's really deeply fulfilling and contributes to your own sense of aliveness.
But to do that, that person would have to give up on the fantasy that he or she is going to be magically cared for.
Yeah, that shows up for me sometimes in this new agey ideas of what I deserve. Like as soon as somebody comes into my practice and they're like, I just don't feel deserving enough. Like that's such a complicated statement to me, because they feel that the solution is for them to feel that they're both entitled to and deserve more. But then it's very difficult for them to finish the half of the sentence, which is from who or from what? And often it'll show up from life. And what I hear under that is just what you're saying, is this projection of a magical parent that, you're entitled to receive magical things from.
And I think if that projection of the magical parent, as you call it, I like that, Joseph, goes far enough, people become kind of bewitched, seduced, or even possessed, that they're in service of a cause or even a cult. and that magical parent that's projected onto whatever it is will take care of me, and I don't have to separate. I don't have to become my own person. I can just be absorbed in this magical other, including a belief system.
And Deb, it's also just a plain old curse. I mean, how many of clients have we seen who have underfunctioned for decades, and sometimes almost perilously underfunctioned, causing a lot of anxiety in us as we're kind of watching this knife's edge that they're walking on between being okay and disaster, with this unconscious feeling that they're waiting to be rescued at the 11th hour by something that never arrives. We've all been there. It's so painful.
That is one of those incredible words, the word rescue. The damsel in distress, whether it's male or female, but someone needs to do this for me. Someone needs to fill me up or come and get me or whatever it is. That rescue and kind of victim orientation is simply deadly to feeling enlivened and being able to appreciate a sense of personal empowerment.
I want to just bring in a slightly different kind of way that this can show up. And I think we can probably all relate to this, is the analysand who seems to have a lot of trouble accepting the authority of the analyst. Now analysts orient to their own authority very differently. And I, for one, am uncomfortable carrying too much authority. Frankly, that's just not my style. But, I do know a thing or two. I have been doing this for a while. I did go to school for a really long time. And so occasionally someone will bring me their story and I will hazard a thought about what might be going on. And I always do it, very tentatively, and I don't want to impose anything on anyone. But, I've had people that no matter how kind of carefully I craft my reflection about what I'm seeing in their story will immediately say, that's not it. No matter what I say.
Just for the pleasure of saying that's not it.
Yes. And I go, okay, that's fine. But when it's, and people of course are more than, of course can reject what I say. I don't have, a kind of a crystal ball and I can see into someone's soul. So I absolutely take it at face value that people get to reject my thoughts. But when it happens repeatedly, then I know that we're in a sort of power and authority play there. And that's always interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of starts to veer into the realm of a kind of compulsion. And sometimes I'm thinking about my own kids of that they go through a certain stage where they have to reject everything that you say. So you can say to a child who's sitting down, please sit down, and the kid will stand up. That there's a part of the psyche that if it hasn't had enough space in childhood to develop out of it, it does have a kind of compulsion to be oppositional. And it looks like, in the consulting room or with a parent, that it's about the other person. But really, especially in an adult, we might say that the unconscious and the conscious or ego position are at war with one another.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I think both with your example of the kid and when I'm thinking about this in the psyche of, say, an analysand, there is a healthy aspect of it.
Oh, yes, of course.
That the person is wrestling with trying to kind of consolidate their own sense of authority. Mm-hmm. And usually what needs to happen, I think, when I see that in someone is I think the person's psyche is inviting them to claim their own authority.
So sometimes in those situations, I feel like I'm the backboard against which someone can practice hitting their tennis balls.
That's great.
You know?
I like that. I like that.
This is practicing finding your own stance, your own opinion, what you think. And so there is, of course, that healthy and just developmental aspect of it that has to start with rejecting the other as a way to move into self.
Yeah, that's just you said that really well. I like that.
I think in my own experience, I often draw people into my practice that have various relationships to the father complex, particularly now later in my life. So we'll often move from, ceding to the father, where they're expecting that I'm going to give them kind of a program of development, which is very seductive because I love giving people reading lists. So I constantly fall in that trap every time I turn around. Here's 10 books I'd like you to read. So then we both actually work through that together. and then we often move into horseplay with the father, is how I often feel it. The way, little boys love to just lunge onto their fathers and, pretend they're in World Federation wrestling matches. I often know that that's okay if there's a good spiritedness in it, or if I feel like the client has a certain subtle glee in the process, then I think we're kind of on track. Where it can become
you're on. I'll do that with you. I'll wrestle with you.
That's right. Where it can get really darker is if the relationship to the father was really dangerous for the child, then what can rise up is a really powerful murderous feeling towards the father. And while it's rare for me to be physically menaced, although that has happened, I've worked in a psych hospital, so I've had to navigate those moments. There can be a kind of psychological murderous feeling towards the analyst as parent, where, I've had clients come in where they've spent all week trying to figure out a way to kind of annihilate something that I had said, or to come in literally with a litany list of all the ways in which, I'm stupid or incompetent or failing them in some way. And I can feel the sadism in the process. And to try to hold that with them without retaliating, but also not conceding to it, it's very, very difficult for all of us.
Now, that's really important to raise that up. And I'm thinking that on the flip side is the seductive parent or authority figure who sort of wordlessly, it's never spoken, sort of sucks the person in to his or her orbit. And I think we see it in, figures that we could probably all name that are really charismatic, that are able to get followers who are unquestioning. And that's another power vortex that can be, that can very easily be generated. So that those flip side of the tyranny on one side of this coin, so to speak, and the other side is the seductive, attracting power of the other that causes you to lose your own sense of I.
And honestly, as analysts, we have to watch out for that, don't we? Because we can get authority projected on us, and that can be seductive for us.
Oh, absolutely. We're all wizards. Somebody wants to make me into a wizard. I'm totally showing up in that big pointy hat the next session. It's really difficult to resist.
Someone, one person that I saw once remarked that I had hair like Gandalf.
Ooh, that's very ambivalent, actually. I don't associate really rocking hair to Gandalf, but there you go.
And it is hard to resist being in the authority position sometimes. We've been talking about it from the point of view of the person who doesn't have authority, but from the point of view of the person who does have authority, legitimate authority, as a parent, let's say, or the authority that others project onto us as analysts. We do want to help And sometimes people says, well, what should I do about this or that? Or what do you think about, what I should do here?
You're all knowing.
Oh.
What should I do?
Well, also our background training as social workers, providing solutions for navigating various systems. I mean, it's, that's a whole other program that's running underneath, our analytic training. It's very seductive.
And there again is a place to navigate of these, sort of polarities of, do we just withhold and never give a recommendation, suggestion, or even a piece of advice? On the other hand, what's going on here? What am I really being asked for?
So there are categories that power have often been parsed out into, and I think it's useful to reference that a little bit because it's a way that we can describe the sorts of power that we respond to, which also tells us how we conceive of our internal power complex. So what we were talking about a moment ago is the idea of expert power, that power comes from others' beliefs, that the power holder possesses superior skills and abilities. And I've seen this many times. I think all of us, particularly as Jungian analysts who have highly specialized training, attract people who think of us as experts in dream interpretation or experts in the unconscious. Also, what I will see is in their own psychological orientation towards accumulating power, they themselves tend to want to become experts in various fields as a way of claiming their own power. So they're attracted to it and they manifest it in that way. So that seems to be something that we're really familiar with. Right now, particularly in all of this cultural crisis, nationally and internationally, there's a great power vacuum that happens in people's lives, and we can be watching to see where people are going towards. And once we identify that, we can also then surmise how their internal power system is oriented. So for instance, right now there is a lot of energy around reward power, and that we tend to move towards power that has the ability to distribute positive or negative rewards. This is something that's happening very dynamically in our COVID crisis. Our president is coming forward and telling governors that he's going to help them out with COVID resources if they're nice to him. And he's not going to help them out if they aren't nice to him. So we have this power dynamic that's based on rewarding or withholding based on how pleasing one is to the authority figure. Now, there's a segment in the culture that finds that very reasonable. There might be a part of ourselves that finds that as a system that feels reasonable in ourselves. If we're part of that reward system, is how we think of power being distributed. Lots of us were raised in that way. If you follow the rules in the house, you get a good mark. Or if you disobey the rules in the house, you get a bad mark. And that kind of pleasing the authority is something that's very common in child rearing as an alternative to coercive power, which is just kind of spanking and punishing. I think that shows up in the analytic environment as well. How many times do we feel that a client is being incredibly compliant and then feels rewarded or is asking us to give them a kind of reward for being really good in Alisans?
I'm thinking about how your idea about the rewarding external power also gets really internal. And I'm thinking about the contract often that couples have that is never, ever discussed, but that we assume, or one person in a partnership may assume that if she does a good job raising the children and having a part-time job and being a good homemaker and a responsive partner and so on and so forth, that somehow 10 years or 15 years down the road, she will be rewarded because she played by, quote, the rules. And so those, quote, rules can be any one of a number of things, but they're internalized, not made conscious, and it's just an expectation that by abiding by those internal rules, a reward will be forthcoming. And there's a lot of disappointment sometimes when that is simply not the case. That the other person had a different set of rules, or life intervened and threw a curveball, as life is wont to do.
And that is particularly complicated, Deb, when a spouse is functioning in a power dynamic in the relationship based on rewards, whether or not something is going to be distributed as a reward. It can be really quiet and insidious underneath it. But then all of a sudden it can grow very stale and very transactional, especially in the context of a marriage. Another power dynamic that I moved over rather quickly is the idea of coercive power. And as social workers, this is something that we were very attuned to relative to various kinds of systems, whether they're family systems, corporate systems, or political systems, that coerce people and dispense punishments as a way of getting compliance. And right now, nationally and on a state level, we're really sitting here in this tension around coercive power. In Puerto Rico right now, and this is coming up to be a big political tumult, but the governor of Puerto Rico has said, people need to lock themselves at home, and people found on the streets and cannot find a good excuse for it will receive a $5,000 fine. The fear of that punishment is a way of coercing people to be compliant. Now, we can make an argument and say that's for their own good, but it can activate a very powerful power complex, both in the collective and in the individual. And we see clients all the time who have an internal power system where the inner figure punishes them when they're not compliant.
I think we see, what comes up for me is the idea of prisons and prisoners as a real image of what coercive power can look like.
Yeah, that's certainly coercive.
I also think that people can be prisoners of their father and mother complex.
Absolutely.
I've seen women who were raised by mothers who thought that they should dress very plainly and never wear makeup, that it was unseemly to seem beautiful, that it was dangerous in the world to be overly attractive, and that as middle-aged women, and they go out and they're in this environment where perhaps they're considering wearing a flattering dress or even wearing a bit of makeup, there is an internal voice that punishes them ferociously for disobeying the family rules, although their parents might have passed away a long time ago.
We internalize those original systems that we grew up in. When we become our own authority figures, and sometimes very punitively so.
And I'm thinking clinically, sometimes people come in and the need for the need for the analyst to hold authority is really strong. And so there's this pressure for there to almost be a power dynamic, if you will. They really are looking to me to kind of lay down the law. It brings to mind this quote from Jung where he says, "Where love rules, there is no will to power. Where power predominates, there love is lacking. The one is the shadow of the other." So, it's like, are we in the realm of power or are we in the realm of love? Are we relating to this as an authority exercise or a relational exercise?
And I think that analysis, if it reaches deep enough, really does transcend these paradigms of power and moves into what Jung called a symbolic friendship. And this rises out of the Rosarium images that the analyst and the analysand come into such a deep communication that both are equally vulnerable in the exchange of ideas and feelings and images. And that kind of intimacy breeds a kind of love in the field. And then authority and power is set aside dramatically, which can be very actually disarming to the analysand.
Yeah, or to the analyst.
Or to the analyst. I think, Deb, you were wanting to say something about the hero's journey as a more archetypal way of facing and engaging power dynamics.
Yeah, I'm kind of flying this idea by you guys. Is that one way of imaging the desired growth and development of our children and family members and analysands is as a way of capturing it, of the hero that dares to ride out on his or her horse and tackle life. That's always in fairy tales imaged as, climbing a glass mountain or slaying the dragon or swimming the fiery lake, of that sense of I will engage on my own self and make mistakes, take risks, encounter unknown challenges, certain things that couldn't be foreseen, but that's the hero's journey of I will take myself out into the world, the external literal world to get a job, let's say, or the internal world to make decisions and take risks and be my own source of authority.
Yeah, and I think that we are talking about moving out of that kind of childlike place where we expect another to take care of us and then rail against that person because that person has too much power and authority over us. And that this is a real kind of psychological piece of work. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to bring up another quote. Jung, in Volume 5, Jung writes, "Life calls us forth to independence. And anyone who does not heed this call because of childhood laziness or timidity is threatened with neurosis. And once this has broken out, it becomes an increasingly valid reason for running away from life and remaining forever in the morally poisonous atmosphere of infancy."
Oh my goodness, that is so powerful. And I know for myself as an analyst, I really hold that and veer into wanting something for clients that are stuck in an authority complex, of wanting them to move out into independence and kind of holding that as a potential place of freedom and growth and development and fun. Of you have the power. You have the power.
So I just want to toss out two more categories of power because that's woven into the style of the authority complex that we're carrying and also projecting out. One more category is legitimate power. And this is something, again, we see all the time, that we believe that authority comes from somebody because they have a legitimate right to demand obedience. And like one of the ways that we're seeing this is when our politicians say that we must respect the office of the president because it's an office that then legitimizes whoever is holding it. Or, we're kids, you have to respect the vice principal because they're the vice principal of your junior high school, regardless of whether or not their behavior is ethical or appropriate.
Yeah.
And this is a terrible area of abuse. You must, for instance, respect your parish priest, even in circumstances where tragic behaviors are being evidences.
Yeah.
So people and situations can be legitimized by their office.
And of course, you've already really pointed out the shadow side of that, Joseph, of that it's hierarchy here is what I'm hearing and thinking about. And parent to child, the military, where people have their rank right there on their sleeves, and how easily, of course, even those legitimate hierarchical authorities and powers can be abused. And so we are called again and again and again to be whole enough to decide for ourselves what's going on and to recognize it, and then to take our own course of action. Because these are all double-sided coins.
Yes. And there's this way that I want to lift up too, that this is power and hierarchy are a part of life.
Yep.
And yes, there is a shadow side. I mean, Adler, who of course was a contemporary of Freud and Jung, and who influenced Jung, his belief was that the will to power was really central, the central drive, really, that we have a need to have power and consolidate power. And there's something to that.
Well, absolutely. And there are those times where we're disciplining our kids and we have to say, because I'm your father. That's why. That's why this is the right way to go. And sometimes it's a legitimate intercession because the kid's about to, take a hammer to their sibling, or they're about to fall down a flight of stairs. So I'm not suggesting that all exercises of authority and power are negative. And I totally agree with you that without some compliance with an authority system, we wouldn't have a civilization.
Right. That's the positive aspect of the father archetype, is order and the legitimate exercise of authority. That's positive father.
Absolutely. And when authority is wielded correctly, the entire kingdom flourishes. And this shows up in those kind of Arthurian legends. The king and the land are one. And when the right positive king archetype or queen archetype manifests in a leader, everyone benefits. And the fields are fertile and the crops are rich and harvested. And conversely, when the leader is corrupt, there is evidence of that the kingdom begins to fail and is plagued by various problems. That's a tremendous metaphor for our internal world. The last area I just wanted to brush against is called referent power. And I would say in many ways, this is the most common authority paradigm that we're experiencing right now as a result of the power of social media. Referent power has to do with influence that comes from a leader because of the way that we identify with them, or we're attracted to them, or that we have some kind of a cultivated respect for them. One of the examples that comes to mind is George Bush Jr. Seems to have been such a popular candidate and was elected because he could be identified with, that people were saying, well, he's the kind of guy that I would go out for a beer with. And so therefore, of course, I would vote for him and give him the run of the presidency. And there's a lot of examples of that kind of similitude that we can cause us to yield to someone.
I see that a lot with celebrities, like a movie actor who suddenly becomes a spokesperson about some, obscure medical treatment or something. And we just sort of believe what the celebrity says, even though that person has no kind of real legitimate knowledge base in that area, simply because he or she is a movie star.
And what about a mentor? That the mentor has more specific expertise in whatever that area might be, but also exerts an influence of personality and values and how things are done. There's a whole personal style that also can infuse us, and we can identify with some of our training analysts or favorite professors in college or graduate school, a very special aunt or uncle, and that those parts are less readily identifiable than how Uncle Joe, taught me to do carpentry.
In summation, I would say that we tend to exercise power and authority often in one or more of those categories which often tells us the kind of authority system we might have been raised with, and we unconsciously propagate externally, the authority system inside of us manipulates the ego's autonomy through these various systems, internal rewards or punishments, this idea of an internal expert, what we used to call a maven in Yiddish, somebody who just knows everything. And all of these internal figures influence what we like or don't like about authority systems outside of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And there are certain qualities that make people more vulnerable to these kinds of authority dynamics. People who tend to prefer things to be overly simple, and they tend to cling to very traditional values, tend to gravitate towards authority and power that's external. People who are extremely conscientious and orderly, and they want to be very dependable. The order and dependability comes from the system telling them what it means to be dependable. And if they are overly agreeable, that they're very good-natured, very cooperative, those kinds of dynamics put people easily into authority systems. And interestingly, people that are more philosophical and have a more psychological development tend to be less seduced by the authority complex.
I want to circle back to maybe almost where we started from, which is this developmental idea that it's natural for us to need to consolidate a sense of power and authority. And I'd like to do that with, I know this is going to shock you all, a fairy tale. And I actually love this fairy tale because I used to hate it, and I had to read it, 18 times a day over a period of 3 months or something to my son when he was little. And finally, after reading it for the 300th time, I understood its psychological dynamics, because I just thought it was kind of silly until I got it. So I'm going to share it with you. The fairy tale is The Three Billy Goats Gruff.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
So in case you don't remember, I will tell it for you briefly. So there are these three billy goats. There's a little billy goat, a middle-sized billy goat, and a big billy goat. And they live on one side of a stream. And on the other side of the stream, the grass looks so much sweeter and richer. And there is a bridge. So they want to cross the bridge and go to the other side of the stream to eat the grass over there. And so the first billy goat, Gruff, starts across the bridge, clip, clop, clip, clop, clip, clop. And who jumps up at a troll? And the troll says, "Who's that crossing my bridge?" Can you tell I've pretty much memorized this? And the little billy goat Gruff says, "Oh, it's only I. Please don't eat me. Wait for my brother. He's much fatter." Right? So the troll lets the little billy goat go. And then the middle billy goat comes, and the same thing happens with the troll. And finally, the big billy goat crosses the bridge, and the troll comes up, and he's going to eat the big billy goat. But the big billy goat is big enough and has big enough horns that he simply kicks the troll over the side of the bridge, and he's washed away in the stream and never heard from again. So what I realized is that this is an image of an ego consolidating itself in order to be able to take a stand against elements perhaps of the outer world or the inner world. And that at first we're the littlest billy goat, and we're not ready. We're not ready to take it on. We're not ready to claim our own power and authority. We're not ready when we're the middle billy goat. But finally, eventually, we get to be the big billy goat. And then we have an ego that can kind of hold its own and take a stance. And I think that this is exactly why this fairy tale is so popular with little kids. But we've all been there, and probably many times throughout our lives. So we all need to be the big billy goat someday.
And that is a great place to leave it for this week. I'm going to take that image out with me. He kicks him into the stream. I'm thinking about headbutting.
Yeah, I think it may have been a headbutt, but you can embroider however you like.
But whatever. Time to go to a dream.
Hi, this is Joseph from This Jungian Life podcast. Lisa, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us with as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you. Our dreamer is a 39-year-old male who works as an observatory museum guide. And here's the dream. There's a viral outbreak. I'm in a car pulling out into the street. I see a lot of police cars parked to monitor traffic. I'm pulled over by the police and taken to a medical facility for testing. The police officer gets tested first by a shot in the arm, and then I'm taken downstairs for a cheaper, less reliable test for the virus. This seems stupid and vindictive. My perspective shifts to a newsflash vignette showing how amidst the pandemic, young men have regressed into grotesque testicular forms who engage in tribal rituals of dysfunctional, impractical sex, chanting, "me to me," or "us to us," like in the sex scene in the film Requiem for a Dream. Very dark and disturbing. The global birth rate is plummeting. From elsewhere on the planet, a pure as the driven snow baby girl is born, and mankind is redeemed. Some significant context the dreamer offers. I'm in lockdown with my girlfriend in a major U.S. city during the coronavirus pandemic, but still working 2 jobs. My professional and personal life is steeped in science communication and science photography. I deal regularly with debunking conspiracy theories. I have been binge listening to this Jungian Life podcast and spending my time in quarantine by pursuing creative endeavors. He says that the feelings in the dream were paranoia, authority, disgust, pity, purity, and renewal. He has a few other thoughts he wanted to share. He writes, "The testicular forms of the young men were very striking. They resembled raw meat wads with tails the size of a large beach ball. They had formed this perverse brotherhood that I felt the need to reason them out of. These forms felt like it had to do with the current political and social movement where communities are having a crisis of faith in their public institutions, leaders, and core values, turning inwards towards tribalism, populism, and paranoid fantasies to simplify an increasingly complex world." I like the way this guy thinks.
I don't know.
But there it is, kind of paranoia, authority.
It's all there. But this is a very perplexing dream. I'm always reminded of what Jung said once when he heard a dream of his first thought was, I have no idea what this dream means. And then, of course, he would take it from there and see what it meant.
Well, one of the first things that happens is he's pulled over by police. And so there is authority. I mean, police in dreams often stand in for, the kind of forces that keep order.
Mm-hmm. And in opposition to this viral outbreak, which is chaos.
Yes. But there's a question about whether this is kind of a legitimate authority, because there's, he's going to get this less reliable test or something.
Well, the police officer, as a part of him, as an image of his own shadow, gets tested first. So he gets a priority treatment. And the dream ego is taken down for a cheaper, less reliable test for the virus. So we have an opposition here between the police officer part of him and the dream ego part of him that feels that this is not legitimate authority. It's not acting legitimately. He's been mistreated.
Of course, that's the ego's perspective.
Exactly. So we have this dichotomy here between these two parts of his psyche. And then if that happens, we go to this news flash with a scene about young men regressing into grotesque testicular forms who engage in tribal rituals of dysfunctional, impractical sex. So it seems like they're self-involved.
Well, it seems like they're self-involved. But isn't that an image of just kind of pure raw instinct in a way? I mean, maybe sort of a perversion of instinct, but something really raw and primal.
And narcissistic.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody know anything about this film, Requiem for a Dream, that he references? I don't know this movie.
I think what he's talking about is there's a particular scene there where, from remembering it correctly, a young woman is desperate to get a heroin fix and then goes to agree to have sex with somebody in order to acquire that. And the filming is very, very close and very intense. And on her face, there's this enormous sense of kind of sweat and pain and kind of horror about what she's engaged in as this, kind of intercourse is happening. So it creates a very complicated set of feelings around it, kind of pain and arousal and despair, all kind of mixed up, which I think he's tried to communicate how he felt that way watching this in the dream.
And then he says of all of this, the global birth rate is plummeting. So I'm putting that together with how young men have regressed, and then all this dark, disturbing imagery, which means that new growth is not happening.
Yeah, there's sterility.
Exactly. If this happens, sterility, stasis, infertility, psychically speaking, happens around the world. And then we have this amazing lysis from elsewhere on the planet, a, quote, pure as the driven snow, unquote, baby girl is born and mankind is redeemed.
Well, there's an archetypal theme if I ever saw one.
I'm always partial to these, the themes that we can see in movies like Frozen and Whale Rider and even something like True Blood, of redemption by the feminine. It's a theme I'm very interested in. And it seems to come out of nowhere as the surprise happily ever after ending to this dream.
I'm having that feeling too. And I wonder, I mean, he does say there was a big emotional reaction to that, but it seems a little, quick. So I guess I'm mistrusting it a little bit.
Yeah.
Where I'm going to is trying to step back a little bit from the dreamer's feeling state around it and just look at the structure of it a bit. And central to psychoanalytic healing is often a descent into the unapologetic, instinctive layers of the psyche. So in the middle of the dream, there is this encounter with this raw, testicular, tribal, lustful, pan-like sexuality, which the ego finds troubling and perhaps even distasteful and ungenerative. But I wonder if he is also underappreciating the value of that primal testicular sexuality, which is really at the basis of all nature. Everywhere you go, even in the middle of the most tragic circumstance, sex and reproduction is happening everywhere. Whether it's the insects that are moving around in your building, in the major
cities,
virus, or the virus itself reproducing in your body. But, the entire world is copulating and reproducing, in this massive, churning, primal reality. And as he is returned to that very unsophisticated part of himself, then something divine, a kind of divine child, can be born inside of him. And I agree with you, Lisa, that to me, it seems more like that initial glimpse of the Holy Grail, which has not been attained.
Yeah.
So there's a potential for this divinely pure reality, which he's brushed against and now undoubtedly will have to undergo a long journey to actually attain it, to have it in his hand.
That's great, Joseph. And it maps with what we know about him, because he, makes the point that he kind of is completely immersed in science and rationality, and spends his time debunking conspiracy theories. So there might be a sort of hypertrophied rationality that needs to be compensated by this raw instinctuality.
Yes, and that would give him the other side of his psyche, perhaps.
I'm back on the word about regression. That from the beginning of the dream, that when the dream ego is given the less reliable, cheaper test for the virus, then the next thing that happens is this regression. In the pandemic, young men have regressed into this instinctual kind of state. And that we know analytically that a regression is often necessary as a prelude to something new coming on board in the psyche. But I think what I initially was feeling and resonating to is that it happens very suddenly. And I'm thinking, if this were really a story, there would be about many chapters of trying this and trying that, and struggling before this kind of redemption came about. So we're missing some of those struggling parts.
And there's stages that are going to emerge as this process moves forward, as he begins to pursue finding the pure as driven snow inner child. The alchemical image that I often reference in our talks, which I find so appealing, is the green lion devouring the sun. And it speaks to how aggressive, how dynamic, how ferocious that encounter with the instinctive level can be, and how the ego can feel eaten and possessed by these instinctive levels, which, particularly to a really rational, science-based fellow, can seem deeply disturbing, and yet powerfully invigorating if he can embrace it.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the backdrop of this being the pandemic, because I do think that there's a way that it feels like the collective situation is kind of doing that to us. The virus itself is kind of like the green lion, isn't it? Kind of just having us for lunch.
Also, in a very practical way, he and his girlfriend are stuck in this apartment or this home for weeks and weeks and weeks. There is going to be a new baby boomer generation that is going to happen 9 to 10 months from now, with all of these people having access to each other in a very lusty way. So there's something very direct about the possibility here.
And he also says that he's compensating for this overly scientific attitude by listening to this Jungian Life podcast. He's binge listening, and spending,
which we highly recommend.
Absolutely, what could be better? And he's pursuing creative endeavors.
That's true.
So something new is really, rising in this dreamer's psyche.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where the process goes.
Yeah, the creative endeavor could easily be imagined as the baby that's born, which is a Christ metaphor, by the way, born and mankind is redeemed.
You think?
You think. And of course, the book of Revelation, there's a female Christ figure, that comes forward in a redemptive way. So the anima coming forward in a very dynamic way in the soul of a man who is highly, powerfully intellectual, redeems him, redeems his feeling function, and also redeems his body, his sexuality, his connection to nature, and the power of nature that he's seeing in these tribally connected men that initially is very negative for him. But he might find himself in the midst of that kind of tribal, fierce, instinctive sexuality and discover that it is an amazing place to be, although right now that seems incredible to him. Well, on that note, the tornado warning seems to have passed here in coastal North Carolina. All that roaring you guys have been hearing behind me is a tremendous 70-mile-an-hour storm that has been passing outside of my recording room here in North Carolina. So I've been in the midst of a primal churning during the entire session and have escaped it reasonably unharmed.
Okay. That will do it for this week.
That'll do it.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.